The first shotgun blast threw her from the saddle into the cold, muddy water of the creek. She was still alive, crawling for the bank, when the second, more brutal blast tore through the air, silencing her forever. The newspapers called her the Bandit Queen, a velvet-clad phantom who rode with the James brothers and ruled the outlaws of the Indian Territory. But the truth was far messier and far more tragic than any dime novel could capture. Who would ambush a woman just 2 days shy of her 41st birthday and leave her to die in the mud? Today, we ride past the legends and the lies to find the real Belle Starr, and to answer the question that still haunts that lonely patch of ground. Who pulled the trigger? Before the gun smoke and the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley, born in 1848 into a world that was anything but lawless. Her home was near Carthage, Missouri, a land of rolling green hills and fertile soil that held a promise of prosperity. Her father, Judge John Shirley, was a man of standing, a prosperous farmer and innkeeper whose family lived a life of relative comfort and respectability. They were slave owners and fierce believers in the Southern cause, their identity deeply woven into the fabric of Missouri's divided soul. This was not a world of desperate poverty that breeds outlaws. The Shirley home was a place of order and aspiration. Young Myra was not raised in a dirt-floored cabin, but was sent to the Carthage Female Academy to receive a classical education. She learned literature, rhetoric, and became an accomplished pianist. You can almost picture it. A dark-haired girl with a stubborn set to her jaw, her fingers flying across the ivory keys, filling the respectable Shirley Inn with music that seemed to hold the roughness of the frontier at bay. She was known to be bright, quick-witted, and possessed of a temper that could flash like heat lightning. She was devoted to her family, particularly to her older brother John, whom everyone called Bud. He was the pride of the family, the embodiment of young Southern manhood, and Myra adored him. In those years, her future likely seemed as clear and orderly as a line of sheet music, a good marriage, a family of her own, a life of influence within her community. But their Missouri was a border state, a land of fault lines and hidden pressures. The very inn where Myra played piano was a crossroads of whispers and arguments. Men passing through spoke of states' rights, of abolitionists, of a nation tearing itself apart at the seams. For the Shirleys, these were not abstract political debates. They were matters of honor, identity, and survival. Every traveler brought news that seemed to darken the sky just a little bit more. The world of Myra Maybelle Shirley, the world of piano lessons, family pride, and Southern gentility, was a fragile one. It was a stately home built on the edge of a volcano. Little did she know that the gathering storm of civil war would not just knock at their door, but blow it clean off its hinges, consuming her brother, destroying her family's fortune, and setting her own feet on a path of rebellion from which she would never turn back. To understand the fire that burned in Belle Starr, you have to understand the land that shaped her. Missouri in the 1850s was not a place of settled peace. It was a powder keg with a short fuse. It was a border state, a place where the deep South culture of the Shirleys, built on land and slaveholding, clashed daily with the free state ideals of their northern neighbors. For families like hers, their property wasn't just soil and buildings. It was a testament to a way of life they believed was righteous, a legacy they would defend with their blood. The Civil War was the spark that ignited that powder keg. This wasn't a conflict of distant armies marching under grand flags. In Missouri, it was a savage, intimate war fought in farmyards and on lonely country roads. It was a war of bushwhackers and jayhawkers, where your neighbor could be your executioner. This was the old scar that would never truly heal, a wound that split communities and families down to the bone. For the Shirleys, there was no question which side they were on. They were Confederates through and through. The weight of the Shirley name now demanded more than just respectability. It demanded action. And it was Myra's beloved brother Bud who would carry that burden into the fight. He didn't join a regular army. He joined a band of Confederate irregulars under the command of the infamous William Quantrill. Riding alongside him were other angry young farm boys whose names would later be written in blood and legend, the James brothers and the Younger Boys. Bud Shirley became a guerrilla, a shadow warrior in a war with no rules. For Myra, this wasn't politics, it was family. Her brother was fighting for their home, for their honor, against an invading force. When Union troops finally caught up with Bud in 1864 and killed him, it wasn't an act of war in her eyes. It was murder. The Union and the entire system of law and government it represented became the sworn enemy of her clan. The feud wasn't with another family over a property line, it was with the United States of America. Her grief hardened into a cold, lifelong vow of defiance. The seeds of the Bandit Queen were planted right there in the blood-soaked soil of Missouri. Long before the war ended, the Shirley Inn had become more than just a resting place for travelers. It was a safe house, a quiet harbor for the Confederacy's most daring and dangerous guerrilla fighters. You have to understand, men like Jesse James and Cole Younger weren't just abstract legends passing through. They were Bud's friends. They were boys Myra knew, young men who sat in her family's parlor, listening to her play the piano while their Colts rested heavy on their hips. Her music was the only moment of peace in their world of ambush and reprisal, and this shared experience forged a bond of loyalty that ran deeper than any law. When the war was lost and the Shirleys were forced to relocate to Syene, Texas, they carried those old loyalties and grudges with them like family heirlooms. They were surrounded by other displaced Southern families, all of them nursing the bitter wound of defeat. In this world, the new Reconstruction-era lawmen weren't seen as protectors. They were seen as occupiers, the enforcers of a victor's justice. A man's worth was judged not by his adherence to this new law, but by his loyalty to the old cause. Whispers travel like wildfire in a place like that, and they clung to Myra Maybelle Shirley. Her association with the Younger clan was common knowledge, and the rumors of a youthful romance with the handsome Cole Younger followed her everywhere. It didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was the perception. She was marked, seen as part of that defiant, dangerous world. She wasn't just Judge Shirley's educated daughter anymore. She was the girl who kept company with outlaws, a woman who understood their codes and shared their enemies. This web of associations poisoned the air, turning small disagreements into matters of life and death. When Myra fell for Jim Reed, it was no surprise that he was one of their own, another former bushwhacker, a man who knew the taste of battle and had no love for the authorities. Her family objected, seeing in Reed the violence and uncertainty that had already cost them a son. But Myra's defiance was absolute. Marrying him was an act of choosing her side once and for all. The ground was now perfectly fertile for conflict. The community was a tinderbox of Civil War resentments. Myra's own reputation was already stained with the smoke of rebellion, and she had bound her fate to a man who saw the law as an obstacle to be overcome, not a shield to hide behind. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the air was thick with the certainty that trouble wasn't just coming. It was already there, waiting for its moment. The dream of a quiet life died hard under the relentless Texas sun. For a time, Jim Reed tried to beat his past into a plowshare, to work the stubborn soil and be the farmer Myra's family had wanted. But the land held no promise for him, and the quiet life felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. There was a restlessness in him, a hunger for the old thrill, the easy money, and the simple, brutal clarity of a fight. Myra, sharp as she was, saw it in his eyes. She saw the farmer fading and the ghost of the bushwhacker growing stronger with each passing day. The human omen arrived not as a single stranger, but as a clan. They were the Starrs, a notorious Cherokee family who lived by their own laws in the wild Indian territory. When they came to visit Jim, it was like a change in the weather. They were men who moved with a different rhythm, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, their hands never straying far from their belts. They spoke in low tones about fast horses, fat cattle that belonged to other men, and lawmen who could be outrun or outgunned. In their presence, Myra could see the change in her husband. The slump of the weary farmer left his shoulders, replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator. Their whispers and laughter late into the night sounded like a prophecy of doom to her. This wasn't the rebellion of a Southerner against the Union anymore. This was the siren song of pure outlawry, and Jim was listening with his entire soul. She must have felt a cold dread settle deep in her gut. This was the moment of decision, the fork in the road she could see as plainly as a line in the dust. She had chosen a dangerous man, hoping she could tame him, but now his world was coming to claim him back. Every clink of a whiskey bottle, every quiet cleaning of a revolver was a sign. It was the feeling of standing on a cliff edge, knowing that the man she loved was about to take a step and drag her over it with him. The time for farming was over. The quiet life in Texas didn't just fade away, it was executed. The news didn't arrive as a whisper on the wind, but as a formal warrant carrying the name of Jim Reed. And the charge wasn't for rustling a few head of cattle or running whiskey, it was for murder. A man lay dead, shot down during a dispute over money, and the law said Jim Reed was the one who killed him. The dream of the farm was over, drowned in another man's blood. For Myra, this was the moment the earth opened up beneath her feet. She was standing at a crossroads, and both paths led through hell. One path was to follow the law of the state, the same law that wore the blue uniform of the men who had killed her brother. To follow that path meant turning her back on her husband, the father of her children, and surrendering him to his enemies for judgment. In her world, that wasn't justice, it was the ultimate betrayal. The other path led deeper into the shadows. It meant choosing her clan over the law, loyalty over respectability. It meant accepting that her husband was a killer and deciding to stand by him, to protect him, to become his accomplice. There, in the harsh Texas sunlight, with the wanted poster acting as a death warrant, Myra Maybelle Reed made her choice. She chose blood. She chose her own. Her reaction wasn't fear, but a cold, hard resolve. The anger she had nursed since her brother's death now had a new focus. The law wasn't a faceless entity anymore. It was a hunter, and its prey was her husband. From that moment on, they were no longer just a family struggling to get by. They were fugitives. Every knock on the door, every stranger on the road was a potential threat. The conflict was no longer a matter of old grudges. It was an open war, a daily struggle for survival. The first drops of blood had been spilled, and they had stained her life forever. It happened on a cold February day in 1889, just 2 days before her 41st birthday. She was riding home from a neighbor's house, the path toward Younger's Bend as familiar to her as the lines on her own hand. The air was still, the winter woods quiet. The only sound was the steady rhythm of her horse's hooves on the hard-packed dirt trail. And then, that rhythm was shattered. The sound of the first shotgun blast was a physical thing, a brutal roar that ripped through the silence of the hollow. It echoed off the bare trees and sent a flock of birds screaming into the sky. Her horse, terrified, reared violently, and the saddle was suddenly, unnaturally empty. There was a pause then, just a few seconds that must have felt like an eternity, a moment of agonizing stillness. Then a second, more deliberate blast followed, its report even uglier than the first. And after that, there was only a profound, ringing silence. Later, it was the horse that brought the first news of the tragedy. It came galloping back to the cabin at Younger's Bend, wild-eyed and trembling, the reins tangled, the saddle empty. It was a message of disaster that needed no words. The men who saw it knew instantly that something terrible had happened out on that lonely trail. When they followed the horse's tracks back, they found her. She was lying at the edge of the muddy creek crossing shed ridden through 1,000 times. The cold, grey water swirled around her, indifferent to the scene. There were no witnesses, only the churned-up mud and the chilling quiet of the woods where an assassin had hidden, waited, and vanished. Her riding habit was stained with the dark, wet earth of the creek bank. The legendary Bandit Queen, the woman whose name was whispered in fear and admiration from Texas to Arkansas, the friend of the James boys and the wife of Sam Starr, had not gone down in a blaze of glory. There was no grand shootout, no final defiant stand. The air still smelled of spent gunpowder. The only other evidence was the profound and terrible stillness where a life had just been. It was an execution, carried out from the shadows, a cowardly end to a life that had been anything but cowardly. The violence wasn't in the details of the wounds, it was in the deafening silence that was left behind. We will never know for certain who hid in that cold brush, but we can try to crawl inside the mind of a man who would. Let's imagine it was the prime suspect, Edgar Watson, a man with a murder warrant hanging over his head like a noose. In his mind, this wasn't an act of pure evil. It was a simple, brutal calculation. Belle Starr had become a threat to his very existence. She had discovered his secret, the crime he had run so far to escape, and she was about to turn him out. That meant the law would come sniffing around, and his life as a free man would be over. In this twisted logic, Belle wasn't a person anymore. She was a problem, a loose end that needed to be tied off permanently. He saw her not as the legendary Bandit Queen, but as the one person standing between him and survival. Killing her wasn't an act of passion. It was a business decision, as cold and pragmatic as shooting a lame horse. He was a cornered animal, and in his world, you did whatever it took to break out of the trap. Honor, friendship, decency, those were luxuries a man like him couldn't afford. The switch flipped the moment he realized she would not be bluffed or bought, the moment he looked into her eyes and saw that she was going to act. That was the point of transformation. His anger and fear cooled into a single, sharp point of purpose. The planning would have been methodical. He knew her routines, her paths. He would have chosen the creek crossing deliberately, a place where she would have to slow her horse, where the terrain gave him perfect cover, where the sound of the shot would be muffled by the hollow. He wasn't a raging monster. He was a patient predator setting a trap. And after the second blast tore the air, what did he feel? Not remorse, not triumph. Most likely he felt a profound and chilling sense of relief. The threat was gone. The problem was solved. As he melted back into the brush, his heart would have been beating fast, but not from guilt. It was the adrenaline of survival. His mind would already be working on the next steps. The alibi, the look of surprise on his face when he heard the news. Whether it was the cold calculation of a man like Watson, or the hot, humiliated rage of her own son, the psychology was the same. Belle had become an obstacle, and for the beast in the shadows, obstacles were meant to be removed. When the echoes of the second shot finally died, a heavy, unnatural silence fell over Younger's Bend. The discovery was as grim and undignified as the murder itself. It wasn't a posse of lawmen who found her, but her own people, led to the spot by her riderless horse. They lifted her body from the cold, clinging mud of the creek bank and carried her home. The fearsome Bandit Queen, the woman who had stared down Judge Parker's court, was gone. All that was left was the mortal remains of Myra Maybelle Starr, her clothes soaked and stained with the earth she had fought so hard to possess. The cabin at Younger's Bend, once a bustling sanctuary for men on the run, became a house of mourning. The whispers of outlaw plots were replaced by the stunned silence of grief. For her daughter, Pearl, the sight of her mother's body was a wound that would never heal. The shock was soon followed by a cold, burning question that settled in the air like smoke. Who had done this? And who among the men and women gathered in that very room knew more than they were saying? The fight for survival was no longer against the law. It was against the secret killer who might be standing right beside them. Word travels fast in the back country, and it wasn't long before the law arrived. Deputy marshals from Fort Smith, Judge Isaac Parker's men, rode into Younger's Bend. They were hard men, accustomed to the violence of the territory, but this was different. This was the murder of the most famous woman in their jurisdiction. They weren't just investigating a crime, They were stepping into the heart of a legend, a place built on a foundation of secrets and lies, where every neighbor had a grudge and every friend had a hidden motive. The investigation began immediately, a slow, methodical process of untangling the web of Belle's complicated life. Who were her enemies? Who owed her money? Who feared her? The list was dangerously long. A reward was posted, a paltry sum that seemed an insult to the scale of her fame. But in a land where loyalty was cheap and life was cheaper, even a small reward could be enough to loosen a tongue or point a finger. The initial chaos of rumor soon began to crystallize around one name. In the fearful whispers of neighbors and the cold calculations of the deputies, the name of Edgar Watson surfaced again and again. The tenant farmer with a secret past, the man Belle was about to evict. He had the motive, he had the opportunity, and he had the cold-blooded history. The hunt for Belle Starr's killer now had a face and a name. Belle Starr's murder was like a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of fear and suspicion spread through every isolated cabin in the territory. This wasn't a tight-knit community bound by friendship. It was a loose collection of families, fugitives, and farmers, all held together by a fragile web of convenience and mutual distrust. Her death tore that web to pieces. Instantly, invisible lines were drawn in the dirt. On one side were those loyal to Belle's memory, her family, the outlaws she had sheltered, and the neighbors who had, in their own way, respected her power. On the other side were those who had feared her, owed her money, or, like Edgar Watson, felt the sting of her wrath. When the marshals from Fort Smith began their investigation, they ran headlong into a solid wall of silence. You have to understand, in the Indian Territory, the law of Judge Parker was seen as a foreign power. The real law was the local code, and that code had one simple rule: you don't talk to outsiders. To be a snitch was a death sentence, far more certain than any verdict from a jury in Fort Smith. The deputies would ask questions, and in return they would get blank stares, shrugged shoulders, and the maddeningly simple phrase, "Don't know nothing." This wasn't just loyalty to the outlaw way, it was raw, paralyzing fear. The killer was still out there. He could be the man plowing the next field over. He could be listening from the shadows at the general store. To speak a name aloud to a lawman was to invite a shotgun blast in the dark for you and your family. People who once left their doors unbarred now checked them twice. A strange horseman on the road was no longer a traveler, but a potential threat. The law offered a reward, but the killer offered a much more immediate consequence. In this atmosphere of terror, even the smallest actions became profound statements of allegiance. True courage was rare, and it was quiet. It was the neighbor woman who left a basket of cornbread on Pearl's doorstep, a silent offering of sympathy that said, "I am with you," without speaking a word. Cowardice, however, was far more common. It was the man who, when asked about Edgar Watson's whereabouts on that fateful afternoon, suddenly found a fascinating spot on the floor to stare at. It was the providing of a vague alibi, the convenient lapse in memory, the turning of a blind eye. Every person in that hollow was forced to make a choice, and most chose the side of self-preservation, burying the truth under a thick blanket of silence. The hunt for Edgar Watson wasn't a grand, sweeping posse of righteous lawmen. It was two separate hunts, running on parallel tracks of justice and revenge. On one track were the U.S. deputy marshals, methodical and official, working for Judge Parker's court. On the other, far more dangerous track, was an unofficial posse, a ghost-like band led by Belle's new husband, Jim July Starr, and likely composed of men who had called Younger's Bend a safe haven. The lawmen wanted Watson in handcuffs. Jim July and his riders wanted him in a shallow grave. The Indian Territory in winter is a merciless landscape. It's not the soaring peaks of Appalachia, but a tangled, brutal world of its own, a maze of dense thickets, frozen swamps, and red clay mud that can suck a horse down to its belly. Watson knew this land. He was a creature of its shadows. He melted into the landscape, his trail as slippery as a water moccasin in a dark creek. For days, the hunt was a frustrating ordeal against nature itself. The marshals followed procedure, while Jim July's men followed instinct, their eyes reading the land for broken twigs and disturbed leaves that the official lawmen missed. Watson was a phantom. A farmer would report seeing a man matching his description near the Poto River, but by the time the posse arrived, he was gone, leaving nothing but a cold campfire. They were always one step behind, chasing a ghost through a wilderness that seemed designed to protect its own. The territory itself was his greatest ally. It was a place where a man on the run could find a sympathetic ear, a hot meal, and a fresh horse from someone who held their own grudge against the law at Fort Smith. Watson wasn't just one man against a posse. He was a fugitive plugged into the lawless network that thrived in those hills. The chase stretched on, the days turning into a week. The pursuers grew weary, their supplies dwindling, their frustration mounting. They were hunting in a land of whispers and lies, where the very air seemed to conspire against them. It felt less like a manhunt and more like an exorcism, trying to drive a malevolent spirit out of a haunted land. Every cold night spent by a fire was a reminder that their quarry was out there, just as cold, just as determined, and driven by the most powerful engine of all, the will to survive. The end came not with a roar, but with a quiet click. It wasn't in a desperate firefight on a windswept ridge. The U.S. Marshals, relentless in their pursuit, finally cornered him. Perhaps it was a tip from someone who decided the reward money was worth more than the risk, or perhaps Watson simply made a mistake. They found him holed up, exhausted, hungry, and out of options. There was no final, defiant stand. Faced with the unwavering steel of the law, Edgar Watson surrendered. The hunt in the shadows was over, but the fight for what passed for justice in that wild country was only just beginning. The air in the Fort Smith federal courtroom was thick enough to taste, a stale mix of sweat, wet wool, and cheap tobacco. This was the domain of the hanging judge, Isaac Parker, a place where the law of the United States finally sank its teeth into the wild frontier of the Indian Territory. The trial of Edgar Watson for the murder of Belle Starr was a sensation. The public gallery was packed to the rafters with a curious and volatile mix. Sober-faced townsfolk, hard-eyed riders from the territory who watched everything with unnerving stillness, and a pack of slick reporters from the eastern papers, pencils flying, hungry for every sordid detail. Edgar Watson sat beside his lawyer, a picture of calm defiance. He wasn't a cornered, terrified animal anymore. He was clean-shaven and wore a borrowed suit, and he surveyed the courtroom with an almost imperceptible smirk. He knew the rules of this game better than any lawyer. His innocence or guilt would not be decided by facts, but by fear. He understood the code of the hills, and he was betting his life on it. The prosecution laid out its case, a carefully constructed web of circumstantial evidence. They had the motive. Belle was about to evict him, exposing him as a wanted murderer from Florida. They had the opportunity. He had no solid alibi for the time of the killing. What they didn't have was a single, credible witness. One by one, Belle's neighbors were called to the stand, and one by one, the wall of silence went up. Men who had spoken freely of their suspicions to the marshals now suffered from a crippling loss of memory. Their eyes would shift, their voices would drop to a mumble, their answers becoming a litany of, "I can't rightly say," and it was too dark to see. You can just imagine the prosecutor's mounting frustration as he watched his case dissolve under the silent, powerful gaze Watson directed at each person who took the stand. The most powerful person in that room wasn't the judge. It was the defendant. He held the lives and fears of the witnesses in his hands, and everyone knew it. They were 100 miles from their isolated cabins, but the threat felt as close as the man in the witness box. The jury was out for less than an hour. The law required them to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, and with only whispers and motive, there was doubt everywhere. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and refused to look at Watson as he read the verdict. Not guilty. A wave of murmurs and gasps swept the room. Edgar Watson simply nodded, as if he had known the outcome all along. He stood up, a free man in the eyes of the law, and walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight. But as he passed through the crowd, a local legend says he came face to face with Belle's daughter, Pearl. Someone asked her then and there who she thought had killed her mother. Pearl, it is said, never took her eyes off Watson as she replied, her voice cold and clear, "I know who killed my mother, and so does Mr. Watson." The court of men had spoken, but out on the courthouse steps, the justice of the mountains had delivered its own chilling verdict. The verdict was a second shotgun blast, this one fired into the heart of Belle's family. For her daughter Pearl, the acquittal of Edgar Watson was an impossible betrayal. The law had failed, and the man she believed was her mother's murderer was now free to walk the same earth. She and her brother Ed were now adrift, the anchor of their chaotic world gone. They stayed at Younger's Bend for a time, trying to hold on to the last piece of their mother's legacy, but the place was haunted. Every shadow in the woods, every creak of the cabin door was a reminder of the murder and the injustice. Eventually, the weight became too much. They drifted away, their lives following a long, sad arc away from the violence of their upbringing, seeking a peace they would never fully find. As for Edgar Watson, he left Fort Smith a free man, but he was a marked man. The court's verdict meant nothing in the territory, where Belle's friends and family held their own silent court. He knew he could never return to his farm, so he fled, becoming a wanderer, drifting from state to state, always looking over his shoulder. He couldn't escape the shadow of the Bandit Queen. For years, he was a ghost, haunted by the murder he was never convicted of. The law had acquitted him, but the court of public opinion and rumor had found him guilty. His ultimate fate is a matter of legend itself, but many say he met his end years later in another squalid dispute, his life ending as violently as the one he was accused of taking. It was a different kind of justice, slow and patient, but just as final. The community around Younger's Bend tried to forget. Forgetting was a form of self-preservation. To speak of Belle Starr's murder was to stir up ghosts and invite trouble. The story was pushed down, buried under the routines of farming and the passing of seasons. The notorious cabin at Younger's Bend, the outlaw sanctuary, slowly fell into disrepair, its timbers rotting, its stories fading into the landscape. The territory was changing. The old outlaw days were dying, and the people who lived there wanted to look forward, not back. The story became a cautionary tale whispered to children, a wild piece of local folklore. They buried the truth under a conspiracy of silence, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for peace. But burying a story like that is like burying a seed. It doesn't die. It just waits in the darkness, ready to sprout again when someone comes along and starts digging. The name Starr didn't simply vanish into the red dirt of the territory. It echoed on, carried by her children, whose lives were forever shaped by their mother's violent end. Her son, Ed Reed, continued a life of petty crime, a pale shadow of the outlaws his mother had known, until he was killed in a saloon argument. Her daughter, Pearl, took a different path. She tried to escape the legacy, but found that the only way to survive was on the fringes of the very society that had sensationalized her mother's life. She eventually settled in Fort Smith and ran a bordello, becoming a different kind of outlaw queen, one who provided a haven not for gunslingers, but for the lonely and the lost. The most tangible trace of Belle Starr is a lonely patch of ground near the Eufaula Lake in modern-day Oklahoma, not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. There lies her grave. For years it was marked by a headstone said to have been carved by her daughter Pearl, bearing a bell, a star, and a poignant poem. Shed not for her the bitter tear, nor give the heart to vain regret. 'Tis but the casket that lies here, the gem that filled it sparkles yet. It was a daughter's attempt to reclaim the memory of her mother, to see the gem instead of the gun smoke. But even in death, the legend wouldn't let the woman rest. Over the decades, Belle Starr's grave was desecrated, plundered by treasure hunters possessed by the dime novel lies. They came searching for the twin Colt pistols they believed were buried with her, for jewels, for anything to connect them to the myth. In 1930, ghouls stole the headstone itself. Later, they even stole what was believed to be her skull. The woman's story was consumed by her own legend, her final resting place picked apart by the very sensationalism that had created her. Today, the cabin at Younger's Bend has long since rotted back into the earth. The courthouse in Fort Smith has been preserved as a museum, its walls no longer echoing with the whispers of her trial. Most of the people who live on that land now only know her name from a road sign or a local festival. But the land remembers. The wind that whispers through the blackjack oaks still carries the story. Though the people and the buildings are gone, the spirit of that violent, defiant and tragic life remains, a permanent echo in the soil of Oklahoma. So we come back to that cold, muddy creek, and the question that still hangs in the air like winter mist: who pulled the trigger? The law books will tell you the case is unsolved, the killer never brought to justice. But the truth, as it so often does in those hills, lies in the whispers that the court refused to hear. The real killer was likely not some romantic, spurned outlaw, but a desperate man with a dark secret, ending a squalid dispute with a blast of buckshot. A pathetic, cowardly end to a life that was anything but. But perhaps the greatest lesson from this saga isn't about solving a murder. It's about how a real person, made of flesh, blood, and contradictions, can be consumed by the legend created for her. Belle Starr was not the mastermind, the velvet-clad rider leading gangs into battle. She was a woman forged in the crucible of civil war, a survivor who used her wits and her connections to build a life in a violent world dominated by violent men. She was a haven, a negotiator, a mother, and a formidable enemy. The true tragedy of Belle Starr isn't found in the manner of her death, but in the theft of her life by the myth that outlived her. This is a story of the untamable, often brutal spirit of the American frontier, and of the sensationalist press that turned real people's pain into cheap entertainment. The newspapers and dime novels gave the world a Bandit Queen, but in doing so, they erased the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, who lived, bled, and died in the mud of the Indian Territory. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.